I want to take a moment and thank one of our leading sponsors and patrons of the Regenerative Medicine Foundation and the Healthspan Action Coalition, which is the international law firm of Hogan Lovells, that's represented here today by 4 or 5 lawyers in the room. Now, you know, my background is law too. Law is the ultimate backstage pass, and you can't get anything done without a good lawyer. So I believe in associating with good lawyers and where I can with great lawyers. So the chair of this next session is my friend Mike Druckman. And Mike is the premier regenerative medicine lawyer, I believe, in the world. And that's going to be evidence to you because he has organized some video presentations called the World Compass on regenerative medicine and cell therapies. Of course, I just call it the World Compass. It has a more lofty name than I gave it. Those videos are with partners from Hogan Lovells from around the world. They're giving a lunchtime video presentations in this room. So when you get your box lunch, you come back in here and you will see that this is truly a global enterprise. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to our chair of this session, Mike Druckman.
Thank you so much, Bernie. Can everyone hear me okay? So appreciate the introduction, Bernie. I'm Mike Druckman, partner at Hogan Lovells and chair of our global cell, tissue, and gene therapy team, which comprises over 150 lawyers around the globe, as Bernie was alluding to, and you can see some of them on video this afternoon. And thank you, Bernie, Wake Forest, and Regenerative Medicine Foundation for putting on this great conference and for inviting us to speak. So today we're going to follow on from that great presentation from Kyle about his own experiences about going to Japan and the challenges in the United States. But we're going to drill down a little bit more on some of the details and really ask those questions are why is it challenging in the United States and what are the specifics and are the ways to overcome that? I'll let each of the speakers introduce themselves, but we're honored to have Dr. Josh Hare, professor of medicine and molecular and cellular pharmacology at the University of Miami and director of Interdisciplinary Stem Cell Institute, as well as the principal and founder of Longeveron, and you can speak about that. We have my colleague, Bryan Walsh, who's an upcoming star in our firm, one of the great leaders in our cell tissue and gene therapy working group, and he'll be speaking about some of the specifics that we've been dealing with companies trying to overcome some of the challenges in the United States. And then Kyle, what we have on the panel from before, and we're gonna press him a little bit and challenge on some of the specifics so that everyone here that has an interest and strategy can think carefully about their approach to developing these important regenerative medicines in the United States and elsewhere. So we're going to start with Bryan, if we could give the mic to him. So Bryan, let's just start. We've heard a lot about, and a lot of grumblings about the difficulties of FDA and dealing with them and all the challenges that FDA put up, the many clinical trials. But I want to press down on that, on the specifics, and included, as Kyle mentioned, gene and cell therapies, including gene editing, are among these regenerative medicines. And we've dealt with some of those products and companies trying to get INDs open in the United States and progress their programs. And so I want to hear, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the specifics. What are some of the specific challenges? So Bryan, let's start with you. So if you could tell us, what are some of the specific scenarios where FDA has taken a position that's pushed companies to move their trials outside the United States, including to Japan, as we heard from Kyle? And where does the agency, FDA, seem to be more conservative than other jurisdictions and agencies?
So we have seen clinical holds on a number of issues, but I think they come in two main flavors, really. There's a lot of concern, particularly with the gene editing technologies, because they're new and novel, and FDA hasn't had a ton of experience with the products, especially on reproductive toxicology report or evidence prior to getting in human. I think what we've seen most and what has been I think what we've seen most and what has been most concerning to some of our clients is really the level of uncertainty FDA is willing to accept in terms of getting to those first in-human clinical trials, and particularly when it comes to off-target editing and gene editing technologies. So we've had several situations where sponsors have been faced with an FDA requirement after discussions with FDA that would essentially require assessing off-target effects of the editing technology in potentially hundreds of cell types, and it would significantly delay clinical trials and the clinical development program, and really without any opportunity to narrow that to what cell types are like most at risk for off-target effects and significant off-target effects. So that's one flavor of it, and then the next comes into really the protocol and the design of the phase 1 or phase 1/2 clinical trials. And I think where this comes into play most is like staggering intervals between cohorts and dose escalation trials. So normally how that works is you have a first cohort of, say, 3 patients, and they're dosed with a relatively low dose of the treatment or therapy that's in study. And following that administration, you have a safety assessment period, and you have a stagger period of when you wait to dose another cohort of patients at a higher dose. And what you're trying to figure out is like the maximum therapeutic dose for the product. Where we're seeing issues, particularly in the context of clinical holds, is when we have autologous therapies that require some sort of extraction from the patients prior to individualized like manufacturing for the medication. I think a great example is apheresis, and FDA has been a little bit firm in saying the 2 cohorts, the first and second, cannot overlap even on terms of apheresis. So the concern there was the first cohort needs to go through an entire safety assessment process to make sure that there's no safety concerns before the second cohort goes through apheresis at all. And this raises some issues because apheresis is only the first step in manufacturing the personalized autologous therapy, and it can take a significant amount of time after apheresis to manufacture and then get that into the patient. So by allowing apheresis to occur with the second cohort while the safety assessment is still going on with the first, you can significantly speed up development. But FDA has taken the position that in the event that the first cohort does not tolerate the product well, the apheresis would not provide any clinical benefit because there would be no eventual administration of the therapy for the second cohort. So apheresis should not occur until we're positive that the first cohort didn't have any safety concerns. So those are 2 kind of flavors that we've experienced. It's reproductive toxicology and your design of your first in trial or first human interactions. So it's
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Bryan. Some important insights, and I'm going to come back to you, but let me start by turning to you, Kyle, and hear you're all right, yeah. Hear your experiences on these topics and whether you've seen that in Japan there's more flexibility in these particular areas or in others that you think are also relevant at what they'll accept for the preclinical work, and whether you think that's lighter or different in Japan, and then these issues about the actual clinical trial design and whether there's more leniency or more flexibility, and why you think that is.
Well, I actually haven't had experience doing a gene editing client through the Japan, so it's not really apples to apples. But they have, I mean, the Japanese have put their flag in around an iPS cell, so they're much more familiar with, more advanced cell therapies. An expanded cell population does not give them, pause. And taking iPS cells is also something that they're very familiar with from a scientific basis. And the Japanese, the pathway is a little bit differently because you start with a certified regenerative medicine program and a hospital approval. So it really comes down to the different hospitals' criteria of whether they will take on that study. And that's the first step. And once that's accepted, the hospitals agreed to do the study to get the differences come in when you get to the Minister of Health for the insurance reimbursement, but it's on a hospital by hospital basis rather than a overarching, from the starting point of doing the trial. And once you get the safety study, the Minister of Health may send you back to do some more of the, the toxicology or studies like that, but you're already a little further in the steps. You could say, this was safe. And then, whereas what Bryan was talking about, you haven't got the point to dose a patient yet. And the FDA is putting these guardrails in place before you even get to the patient, which I think is one of the major differences. It's a little bit of a more intimate starting point because you're working within a hospital at the first point.
Got it. And is it, certainly, is it typically that in Japan, the one hospital will do all the work, so the apheresis all come from that hospital, rather than having multiple sources?
Yes and no. I mean, you can have a contract manufacturer as well, or an outside manufacturer that is generally part of the hospital, but not always. So it doesn't have to be that way, but that's generally the system.
Got it. So Dr. Hare, we'll turn to you on this question. I know you're working toward and considering Japan, and also with your company have made some advances in the Bahamas. I'd like to, which has a very different scheme. So if you could spend a couple minutes just telling us about your experience and whether you face some of these challenges and what are some of the differences there.
Great, thanks for the question. So basically, my comments are going to pertain to what Longeveron is doing as opposed to the University of Miami. I'm still full-time at the University of Miami, but a co-founder of Longeveron. Longeveron's had a number of challenges with its mesenchymal stem cell product called Lomecel B, largely that the challenges derive from the fact that one of the key indications they've wanted to pursue is an indication that hasn't been approved anywhere in the world by any regulatory authority, and that indication is aging frailty. So Longeveron has developed phase 1 and phase 2 data that IV infusions of Lomecel B may be effective in treating aging frailty, which is a very serious medical condition and affects huge numbers of, far outweighs the impact of Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, and cancer combined. So this ties into the whole problem of, is aging a disease? And we hear about this in lots of books written about it, there are lots of discussions. Will the FDA ever approve an anti-aging condition, or in this case, an anti-frailty therapeutic? So to address that, Longeveron has opened programs in both Japan and the Bahamas, and has done a trial in the United States. So it's basically operating in three territories. It did the phase 2 trial in the United States and is making a decision about what the next step in the United States should be. It's very challenging with the FDA because the FDA there's no precedent for that indication in the United States. Similarly, in Japan, there's no precedent, but perhaps a greater interest, and perhaps because of the regulations in Japan, more flexibility. So Longeveron is presently enrolling a phase 2 trial in Japan at 2 hospitals led by the Jutendo Hospital in Tokyo. And patients have already been enrolled, and the hope is to get this hospital-based approval after the enrollment of 45 patients and a demonstration of safety in concert with the US data that's in 150 patients. Now, because of the type of indication, there's been a tremendous grassroots interest in the product. Individuals who are in their 80s aren't interested in waiting the 10 years that it might take to get a regulatory approval to treat their frailty or their pre-frailty. And so we tapped into very favorable regulations in the Bahamas. The Bahamas allows through government oversight of a committee called the NSEC, allows you to apply and be able to treat patients under an open label registry in the Bahamas. It is research, but it's not placebo-controlled research. So patients do sign a consent form. The enrollment criteria are much less rigorous than for a clinical trial. And so Longeveron over the last 6 years has been able to deliver about 250 infusions into patients who self-selected. Many of those patients had a choice. When we were enrolling patients in a phase 2 trial in the US, we said to people, if you're interested, you could be in a phase 2 trial in the US, or you could go to the Bahamas. And many of those people elected to go to the Bahamas. So as I said, we've gathered data from about 250 patients there. So I think that falls under the rubric of what we could consider real-world evidence. We are following these patients for safety and some efficacy measures. There's a DSMB that monitors the safety of the patients, and it's a very large cohort. Many of the patients have received multiple infusions, so we also have a data set about the safety of the Lomecel-B product over multiple infusions. And I think it's becoming increasingly popular, and there's increasing demand for people leaving the United States to seek infusions or treatments of some kind elsewhere. I think that this is a big part of, there are two ways to look at that. Some people could say, well, those patients are being taken advantage of. I think this is patient autonomy, self-selection, and patients' right to try. I think it's an unfortunate side effect of how long it's taken to get any kind of approvals in the United States, because if these products were approved in the United States, they could be made available through the practice of medicine to these types of patients. You know, as you look around the world, you see that there are allogeneic MSC products approved. It's just the United States is very much behind. We heard in the last talk about the Mesoblast product for GVHD in Japan. They got turned down on their BLA here in the US. There's a product in South Korea for osteoarthritis. There are products for all sorts of colitis. And so I think that this is why a program like the Bahamas can be so valuable and can enable open access to individuals. The thing that another very important feature of what's happened in the Bahamas is people who really have very serious illnesses and really want to pursue the right to try are able to do that there. They simply can't do it in the United States. Manufacturers of products have tremendous barriers to engage, to providing right to try open access products, but that can be done in the Bahamas, and some people have been very satisfied with that. In the meantime, Longeveron collects the safety data.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hare. And it's evident that a mixed approach, trying to take advantage of all the different options, and not necessarily to eliminate the United States as a possibility, given the market and given the reputation for products that actually have gotten approval, but not to use that only as the only option, given the time pressure and the importance of bringing these medicines to patients early. I'd like to pick up and then turn to Bryan on something, but just to segue to Bryan, you mentioned the real-world evidence piece. And that's, FDA and the United States has been talking for a long time about trying to make innovations in the regulatory side that will help improve the efficiency of getting these products approved and to allow for earlier approvals that will be confirmed after the fact. And so real world evidence, using evidence in actual patients that have received it in a therapeutic context, not necessarily under the same exact rigor that you would in a clinical trial, has been something discussed and it's still being sort of pursued. This afternoon, we have another talk. We'll talk about some of these evolving policies and how in the United States they're starting to be implemented, and how what we collectively might do to help push those things along. So turning now to you, Bryan, we are going to talk about some policy shifts and adjustments. FDA recently published a draft guidance on using generally accepted scientific knowledge in BLA submissions, which is another way to try to narrow and make more feasible these clinical trials and make them shorter, to rely on what's already out there. So could you tell us just a little bit about what does this guidance do? Do you see opportunities for sponsors to take advantage of this guidance for trial with the United States? And is this promise that perhaps the United States should be still considered part of your portfolio of strategy, and maybe there's more opportunity in the future?
Yeah, I think this guidance, my colleagues and I are pretty excited to see how it plays out and how it's implemented by FDA. I think it stemmed from two kind of overarching issues. There was a recent amendment to the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act that kind of put more emphasis on avoiding unnecessary animal studies. And then there is also a kind of a regulatory gap in the biologic space between what is a biosimilar who relies on like a reference biologic product for all their safety and efficacy studies, as well as, and then there's the standalone biologic license application. The way that our clients get into like interesting situations is when they bring a product, maybe it's for a new indication or a new route of administration, but the mechanism of action or the target of the product is well known in the scientific community. The science backs that alteration to a biological pathway, and we know how that works in the body and how it affects. But in the biologic space, unlike the drug space, there's no way to kind of tap in, or at least before this guidance, there was no way to tap into that scientific knowledge, because you either don't have a right of reference or you can't really use literature studies to support a BLA application. On the drug side, you have something in between a full new drug application where you conduct all your own clinical studies in support of a product, and generic where you rely on an approved product for all the clinical studies and just show bioequivalence. What's called a 505(b)(2) new drug application, and what you can do in that space is you reference a product that's already approved, show that you're similar and establish a scientific bridge, and then all you have to do is justify the changes from that product with clinical data or other data to achieve approval. So you're basically using FDA's previous decisions on the safety and effectiveness of a product that's similar to yours, but you're not a generic product. There's no corollary in the biologic space. It's either one or the other, and this kind of fills that gap. So the guidance is limited to non-clinical studies, and it's essentially aimed at if there is a product that we know affects fertility or fetal development, and there's a class of products, they're all labeled the same, we know exactly how it is, there's no point in reconducting those animal studies. We can essentially just use that literature that we already know about this product and get into clinical trials of like how this product works in the new indication or what's different about this product and how it can bring benefit to patients. So I think it'll be really exciting to see how FDA implements it and the breadth of how far they're willing to go with what is generally accepted scientific knowledge. But it's interesting.
So there's some hope.
Yeah.
Not necessarily an answer to bring the United States equivalent, but it's at least in principle a point that people should pay attention to and consider implementing and leveraging, particularly if you're going to get data outside of the United States, but it starts developing sort of more understood principles. Dr. Hare, did you have something that you wanted to add to that point?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought you. Kyle, do you have any? I know we're sort of coming to the end of time, but any last thoughts before we open to any questions from the floor?
Well, I think that's it's a great first step to not have to repeat, for every company to have to repeat work that we know is going to be the same results. And that's going to help things move forward. But I think that, it really highlighted to me last night in the last panel we had with Dr. Talo and Dr. DeGray, where we talked about FDA's approach. They had a drug that is 95% effective, and they dig into the 5%. They really go back to the 5% and the 5%. And I think it's an overall, mindset of almost, I know their goal is safety, and everyone is about safety. And that's why I think, working in the Bahamas and working in Japan, we're not cutting back on safety. You're conducting rigorous clinical trials, but I think it's the overall mindset of like digging into that 5% rather than acknowledging the 95% and acknowledging what that does for the millions of patients that could benefit from that technology, but also for the GDP of this country. I'd love the FDA to have like a criteria where like, the healthcare concerns for this indication are $1 trillion. And if we make this approval, it will actually have a real economic impact on the healthcare as well. And it would be great to see a future correlation between economic impact and indication in the future as well.
It's a really good point. FDA's history flows from some very discrete examples where, unfortunately, there's some really significant health crisis. There's thalidomide, which was its very well-known situation. There's one reviewer at FDA who held her ground against the company. And in Europe, it was used, and unfortunately, it led to birth defects. And this reviewer at FDA was given like the gold medal from the president. And so that's part of the ethos of FDA. But you raise a very important point, Kyle, is that there are balances, and FDA is aware of that. But it's really a matter of where you put the fulcrum and how you balance it, and what you're most worried about, and whether there's a way to be more transparent with patients, with doctors, with everybody, so that you can recognize, somewhat like happened during the pandemic, that we had these emergency use authorizations that were issued, and I'm not sure everyone fully understood, but it was that everyone around the country were getting injections on products that had not gone through the full approval process, but FDA did its best to make that clear. And I think that was relatively understood, and it was a very important policy balance. So I guess we have time for one more comment, and if there's questions, we just have probably time for one or two. But Dr. Hare, it looks like you've got...
I just want to make a very important and quick point that people get very, very confused about, and it's really just semantics. I think everybody should be aware that approval does not equal proof, right? And we tend to talk about that's an unproven therapy because it's not approved by the FDA, right? And they really need to keep a distinction in your mind between what is the level of scientific evidence and was that enough for FDA approval? There are plenty of things that are proven to work, but are not yet approved because they haven't met a very high bar And so those words are not synonymous. And I hear that all of the time at scientific meetings. That's an unproven therapy. No, it's an unapproved therapy. It's different.
That's a very important point. And we'll be talking this afternoon a bit about that point, which is where FDA is right now. I think they're at an inflection point. And there was a long sort of standard tradition of FDA's view of being the gold standard, but it was against a context of small molecule drugs that were very different, that typically, were very easy to characterize relatively, and were for large patient populations where you could do a trial in extremely large patient populations and have a lot of certainty based on the size of the trial. And with biologics and cellular therapies, it's a very different sort of scenario. I'm getting the flag. Do we have time for one question? Two questions. So, for Dr. Brea, there's a woman behind you that first, you'll be second. So, yes, we'll give you this one. There you go. Well, let's let the lady first, and then followed by you, Doctor. Thank you so much, Gray.
So much. Thank you for that presentation. I was wondering if you could speak to the difference in terms of litigation by patients who might be harmed by biologics in these different countries. It seems to me that the US has a litigation issue with liability. I mean, if we go all the way back to the swine flu vaccine and the lawsuits then, I'm just wondering if that's part of the issue with approval, as you said, versus proof. It's the downstream events that might be quite chronic or long-term, like cancer, when you're talking about an advanced cell therapy.
You want to take that one?
I have some thoughts, but
Yeah. Why don't you take that one, Mike?
All right, I'll start. So, really great question. And I haven't done a study of the comparative litigation risks in different countries, so I'm just going to give you my impressions. And that is, one thing to understand is that for FDA approval, there are certain protections once you get FDA approval. And so there are certain types, it's very difficult to sue on an approved product. There are ways of failure to warn, but if FDA has approved your labeling, then there is a certain amount of preemption that prevents someone from going to state court and getting a judgment based on an approved product. Now, it's different for investigational products. It's also different for the tissue, the HCTPs that are marketed without FDA approval. So there is an element there. My sense is that the United States is a relatively litigious society, and that could be part of it. And so I would like, it's a great question. It provokes me to look at that a little bit more and consider it. But I haven't heard of major cases in other countries that would influence it. So thank you for the question. I'm sorry, I don't know if any of my colleagues have any additional, but it actually prompts me. So we're going to follow up on that. Thank you. Dr. Gray.
Thank you. Great panel. I just wanted to actually ask a relatively similar question, because let's face it, the FDA, they issue all these guidelines, they've got, a certain amount of discretion about things, but at the end of the day, the overarching defining feature of what the FDA does is the law. It's what the legislation says, which is defined by other people, people who want to get re-elected. So ultimately, I feel that the people that we really need to convince in order to bring about change in the topic we've been discussing today are the general public, the people who vote for change. And the litigation aspect springs to mind because obviously I'm from that far off place called the rest of the world originally, and so I obviously somewhat giggle at the addiction to litigation in this country. I'm wondering really whether there needs to be more litigation on the other side. In other words, suing the FDA or the government for failing to approve something that could have saved your kid's life or whatever. But the question is, what can we do? What can we tell the public? And of course, I'm asking this because I do a lot of media interface and so on. What can we tell the public that will help them to encourage changes to legislation that would thereby feed down into changes to FDA policy?
Yeah, well, that's a great point. And FDA is a function of law. And when I was there, it's quite clear they take that very seriously. And although there is some flexibility to interpret the law, there are limits. And so getting legislative change, as you know, is a difficult thing. I don't know if any of my colleagues have any comments.
Well, there's just the case of the telehealth, the DEA and the telehealth for substance abuse, Schedule 1 substances for telehealth, and the FDA put up like a 1-month comment section, and then they were going to revert back to their pre-COVID, because during COVID they allowed the shipping of Substance 1 with a telehealth overview. And they got 38,000 comments in that 1 month, and they went back and said, we're going to stick to the the COVID allowing this to happen while we do another review. And I think it was really that active response. They give a 1-month window, kind of push this through under the rug, and the public responded in a really robust manner, which gave them pause to really give a full review of that. So I think that it's really being an active, calling your constituents and asking for what we want. But so many people are so beaten down on politics that it's hard to get that movement.
I want to follow up on that. That's a great point. And I have seen some patient advocacy. I know that's one of the threads in this conference is patient advocacy, that it actually can be effective. And I've seen cases where very heartfelt patients come in and share their story, and it doesn't fall on deaf ears. I mean, FDA still has to look at the data, but it can make an impact. I mean, Cystic Fibrosis Foundation is an example of one patient advocacy group that's made a real impact in some ways. So I think we're getting the hook to come off the stage, but I appreciate the questions, and I do think it would be worth some follow-up to consider ways that collectively we can make an impact on policy, on the legislators, and on FDA in some cases. So I want to thank, again, Dr. Yes, thank
Great
you.
example.
And that's a great point, just for the recording.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, well, he was just...
Great comment by
it was
Stephen
just-
Chang. Another great
just-
comment about how important the HIV
Yes.
community was in moving the needle with the FDA and the regulatory, which is the whole purpose
Absolutely.
of patient advocacy, a major thrust of this event. So thank you,
right.
Steve, for that
Well,
comment.
I want to thank Bernie again for inviting us, and thank you for your interest, and look forward to the rest of the conference. And thanks my panelists for
Let's give a hand
engaging.
to this wonderful panel, informative.